Hello again, it's Steve Smith, and welcome back to another of my sessions for language teachers. CPD presentation number 21, Teaching in the Target Language. This one might be a little bit longer, but I know it's an issue that is of concern to teachers. I guess all of us at some time have had that guilt feeling that we're not using the target language enough in class, or have asked ourselves the question, how much target language should we be using? Is the actful American recommendation of 90% target language, is that about right? Is it not really an issue and you just have to adapt to your class and so on? Well, I want to try and help you through some of these issues, and with a mixture of research and some hopefully very useful practical advice. So here we go. Firstly, why is it said that target language is important? Let's get back to some basic principles here. And I've given you a couple of quotations there. On the left we have Rod Ellis, who reminds us that the opportunity to interact in the target language is central to developing second language proficiency. I've given you the reference at the end, by the way, for that article, which is open access. And then writers Patsy Lightbound and Nina Spada, comprehension of meaningful language is the foundation of language acquisition. So I don't think you'd find any researchers who would disagree that comprehensible input is really important, and that therefore means target language use in the classroom, whether it's through speech or through writing. But it doesn't really answer the question of quite how much. What certainly does seem to be the case, and this here I'm quoting from Ofsted, that's the inspection body in England, who've observed over the years thousands and thousands of language lessons in classrooms, secondary classrooms mainly. And in their report going back to 2010, and I don't think the situation will have changed very much at all, they said that their report highlights weaknesses and barriers which prevent good language learning, including insufficient use of the target language. And they go into this in a good deal more detail, but certainly there's a feeling out there that we are still not managing to use the target language enough in the classrooms. So how do we increase the amount of target language use? And it's possible to imagine that by having just some routines, like entry routines when students come into the class and you tell them to sit down in the target language, or you use ritual phrases like turn to page or look at me or repeat, whatever, that those kind of ritual uses of target language are somehow important. Actually, I think they're probably the least important thing. They're quite useful for oiling the wheels of a lesson and linking from one task to the next and so on. But actually far more important is the use of target language once you've got classroom activities underway, and how do you manage to keep the language comprehensible while doing all sorts of different activities. Now, if you've listened to me before, you'll know that one of the things I often go on about is the skilled use of question-answer technique and other similar interactions. So that's just a quick summary of the types of ways that you can interact with, for example, written texts, picture sequences, classroom objects, whenever you're engaging in classroom conversation. So that's the reminder of the sort of range of skills of questioning that you've got, which you can use. And for me, that's a fundamental part of target language use. And as well, once you're operating with the class and you're trying to stay in target language, there are all sorts of little tricks of the trade, that you'll have your own, no doubt, but little ways that can help this work. Often you might want to choose a high-attaining pupil just to get things going if you throw out a question. You can use the return to student technique. That's the one, for example, where you've asked a student a question and perhaps they've struggled with the answer. So then you go to 2 or 3 or 4 more students, and then you return back to that first student so they get a chance to succeed with their answer. That's called the return to student technique. You've clearly got to be careful about how you correct and do recasts and prompts and model good responses. I'd beware of totally random questioning techniques, like so-called lolly stick or popsicle approaches. I think that can be frustrating for classes. But of course, you can build in some cold calling, some no hands up, but where you exercise your skill as a teacher to choose or to match questions or prompts to students who you think can provide the answer, and to differentiate in your questioning and interactions to allow everyone to take part. You could even build into lessons and sections where you're going to say, okay, for the next 5 minutes, no hands up, please. I'm just going to do cold calling, as it were, and tell the class why. I mean, you can use your own sense of humour and your own personality traits to help target language work go well. Exaggerated praise to students for humorous effect, making deliberately wrong statements to provoke a reaction. Silly things like, choosing a student whilst looking in the opposite direction. So you look across to the right-hand side of the classroom while asking someone who's on the left. That can keep the kids on their toes. Facial expressions, gestures, whatever it takes to sort of engage the class with you and your interactions. Don't forget wait time, especially if you're using cold calling or hands-up questioning. So when you ask a question and then give a few seconds when you say no hands up, so that students have a chance to rehearse answers in their head, and where the students who are slower to respond have a better chance of being able to answer. I mean, the range of classroom activities that you can bring in to make sure you stay in target language is huge, and I've just chosen a selection, some of which you will use already, perhaps not all of them. Obviously, whole group repetition and its variations. Part group repetition, you may not use this, where you choose a particular row or group or pairs, so you can go from whole group repetition, choral repetition, to part group repetition, to individual repetition. Reading aloud, either individually or choral reading aloud, really good for phonics work. We describe in our book, Breaking the Sound Barrier, all sorts of reading aloud games or game-like activities that you can use which involve target language use. Little tricks like when pairs are working in the target language, they take turns until someone runs out of ideas, so the person who cannot produce a response is the loser. That's often a nice little motivational trick. Guessing games are great. I've mentioned to you before disappearing text. That's where you have a text on the board on one slide, you've done some work on it, and then in the next slide you take a few words away and students have to remember what the missing parts were, and then gradually you can remove more from each slide. As well as question answer, we've got the idea of making up false utterances, which can be corrected by partners or teachers. We've got information gap tasks in all their different forms, and singing along, miming games. Silent customer, that's one where students work in pairs and one student has a shopping list and has to mime what they want to buy, and the partner has to come up with vocabulary to guess what the items are on that customer's list. Transcription tasks of any sort, dictation, variations on dictation like running dictation, delayed dictation, which I've described before. That's the one where you say a chunk or a sentence and then give, say, a 10-second delay before students have to write it down. All sorts of reading aloud activities, role plays, dialogues. All of these involve target language use, don't they? And so it goes on. I used to have fun with this particular activity, making up a story one word at a time. So once the class are ready for this and they have enough vocabulary at their disposal, you just go round either in order around the classroom or choosing people at random, and they have to keep a story going, but only using one word at a time. And this forces them to make grammatical decisions, vocabulary decisions. And when you get to the end of a sentence, students are allowed to say full stop, and then you can move on. Word association, I think, is a great lesson starter, for example, just to recall vocabulary, to give some retrieval practice in vocabulary, and, of course, well-known accumulation games. I go to the market and I buy, as you gradually build up a list of items, and so on and so on. So, all of these provide opportunities for TL use. But I'm certainly not one who would argue for 100% target language, although there are some teachers who seem to be able to make that work. But I think there are plenty of reasons not to use the target language. Now, I've listed some that occur to me here. I think if you're setting up a complex activity, for example, an information gap task or some sort of pair work task, I think it saves time and actually allows for more target language use if you do explain that in English. So to set a task up quickly in English to make sure it's understood. Otherwise you get that situation where once students start working, if they haven't totally grasped what they're doing, you're then wasting time later having to re-explain the task. So I think that's one use for English. I think giving any complex cultural information, where you're storytelling about your own experiences in other countries and so on, I think that's great. I think most behaviour issues would be dealt with in English. Maybe setting lesson objectives if you like to do that. I've never felt that should always be a necessity for lessons, but if your school's policy is that you should set lesson objectives, or if you like to do that, then consider doing it in English. It's a nice way of easing students into a lesson, I think, isn't it? To take them with you rather than suddenly hitting them perhaps with target language when their mind might still be distracted by what's happened on the way to the lesson or the previous lesson. So sometimes you just need to ease a class in, I would say, before you start working in the target language. I think often putting a piece of work into context like a pre-reading or pre-listening task, that might be done in English, again for similar reasons to the ones I was just describing. The idea that it eases students into the activity, because the main return you're going to get is target language use during the activity. I think if you worry too much about instructions and rituals in the target language, if that's not going to help with the subsequent activity, then I think do whatever it takes to get the class interested. I think nearly always you can explain grammar in English and maybe give notes about grammar. Sometimes you might be able to do that in the target language with more advanced classes, or particularly able classes, shall we say. And there are all sorts of things that you'll do, assessment for learning sort of activities, formative assessment work, and stuff, for example, like looking at model test questions, mark schemes, otherwise known as rubrics, setting targets, all sorts of things where you're going to have to use English. And also modelling metacognitive strategies. So if you're trying to help students do well in assessments and for specific activities, you'll need to talk in English to them, won't you, about the sort of strategies they can use to help. I think sometimes giving complex feedback, in exercise books, if you're writing a note to them, is it possible that you're making a stronger psychological connection with students if you do that in English? Is that going to be more powerful? Because when a student hands in a book to you, this is their personal form of communication to you and your personal form of written communication to them. And maybe it could be more powerful if it was done in English, if you want to help establish that individual connection with students. I think another great use for English is actually to talk to classes about language learning. It's something I enjoy doing, and it gives them an insight into your thinking and might in some way help students get on board with the tasks that you're doing. I think if your setting allows you to set homework, to give homework to students, of course that needs to be totally clear. You could do this in the target language first and then have a student interpret the task. That's quite common practice. You could just do it in English, because the key thing is that they know what they're gonna do. I think there'll be times as well when you're running target language lessons when you'll want to check for understanding with students. And of course there are times when you're doing translation tasks anyway, and where it's useful to move from target language to first language, backwards and forwards. So, what if it's not working? What if, you're full of good intentions and you think your technique is sound, but it's still not working for that class? Well, I think my own advice would be that sometimes you have to make a little retreat, perhaps before you can advance again. You might want to consider, resorting to more English than you would ideally to get the class back on board first before returning to your sort of ideal approach. I mean, there are methods which can work well, which are quite bilingual in nature. I mean, schools that are using, for example, knowledge organizers, where typically they have sets of sentences in their booklets, both in English and the target language, and where the class is constantly mixing target language and English. That leads to a very transparent form of learning, what you might call bilingual learning, where everything is made totally explicit, and clearly quite a lot of English is being used in those circumstances, but then so is quite a lot of target language, and of course it's all comprehensible. So I think in that approach you might see quite a bit of English being used, but nevertheless still lots of target language. I mean, you might want to just, as I hinted at earlier, explain to the class, why you're using target language. Let them into your little secret about how we learn languages, and how, at least to some extent, they're like a young child learning a language. I would say things like, when you were young, you learned to speak and understand English by the age of about 4, and no one told you how to do that. No one gave you vocab lists to learn and so on. How did that happen? And can we try and make the same happen in this little time we've got together, both in class and for homework? One technique you might like to use is to imagine in your lesson planning that you're working in bursts of target language for up to, let's say, 10 minutes or maybe shorter periods, and then kind of release tension, as it were, by allowing some English. So in other words, you wouldn't go for that sandwiching technique where you're constantly mixing up the target language and English. The danger with that, of course, is that students only listen to the English, they don't listen to the target language, but where you actually say, okay, for the next 5 minutes, it's going to be Spanish only, or German only. And then, get the class on board for working to that time limit, then release the tension, and then go back into target language. I mean, there are other random tips I could suggest. Have a sign or signal to show when only target language is allowed. You can even do things like just apologize to the class if you use English, because kind of that sets the right tone, and it shows you that you're one of them. Oops, I used English, and sorry about that. Some teachers like to give rewards to students who never use English, and of course you're going to use maximum use of classroom objects, realia, pictures, gestures, whatever it takes. And there are specific challenges that you can give. Ask them to rise to the challenge. Other tricks for making your input comprehensible, which is a really important thing, isn't it? Things like using cognates where you can, slowing down your speech. Lots of that oral gap fill technique I've talked about before, when you say you're going to start a sentence and then they have to finish it based on work that you've done previously. You might not want to get overly obsessed with accuracy. If decide perhaps in your lesson planning if the focus is on accuracy, focus on form, or on just general fluency, general proficiency. Mini whiteboards obviously help. You could give points for spontaneous target language use. And of course, the general point here is that we're not going to expect students to be spontaneous very soon. They've got to go through a long, long period of controlled practice with very structured input and lots of repeated chunks and patterns of language before eventually, when they are ready, depending on their abilities and the amount of input they've had, that they will begin to produce spontaneous language themselves. You can't rush them to do that, and if you do that, of course, the danger is that they resort to instant translation, get things wrong, make mistakes, and then feel that they're not very good at it, that they don't get that feeling of self-efficacy that we want them to have, that feeling that they're good at what they're doing. I would also say when it comes to using tech, my preference was always to look for any activities where the focus was on input, whether it be listening to video, interactive grammar exercises, the sort of things you get with programs like Textivate, TeachVid, for example, languagesonline.org, where you're interacting with the language. I think tech tasks that get you making things or getting overly focused on the tech itself at the expense of the language perhaps are less useful. So there are some awkward questions, Students are easily confused. Weaker students do struggle to concentrate, so they will need a bit more support and probably a bit more English. It is the case that it takes time to master a language or a repertoire of language within that language. So explain to students that takes time. The short-term gains will be there, but it's the long-term gains that are more important. There is an issue about teachers' own proficiency. There are teachers who find themselves teaching languages that they're not particularly qualified to teach, but they've been forced to. So that makes life much harder. Anecdotally, I'm fortunate that my French was pretty fluent, so I never had a problem at any level, but I did have to teach German for a while, and that was a frustration to me that I couldn't be as fluent in my German as I wanted to be. And I'm sure I used more English in that situation. So that's an issue for departments to deal with and support their team as much as they can. So that was a quick rush through some points. I've got one or two references for you. That was the reference from Rod Ellis from an article, Principles of Instructed Language Learning. And the quote from Lightbound and Spada was from How Languages Are Learned. A little shout out for this book called Target Language Toolkit by Alison Chase. And that's got lots of practical ideas, including ideas on departmental policies, how you can get the whole team using target language. And then a reminder about the book that Gianfranco and I wrote, Breaking the Sound Barrier. Virtually all of the 200 plus activities in that book feature large amounts of comprehensible target language. So thank you very much for listening to that session, and hope to see you again. Bye for now.